Hi, I'm Seb, and today I'm going to show you how I made this modular terrain to go on my Wild Beyond the Witchlight carnival board to mix it up and use it in different ways. Playing around with the encounter terrain method of trees, I absolutely love this and I'm going to be using this a lot more going forward. This was one of the cooler builds that I've thrown together in 24 hours. The hardest part of this is waiting for it to dry. The idea of this piece is to be as modular as possible so I can move it around and reuse it on the table to add some elevation to my board. The magnets are so I can mix and match and move it around and have as many different functional uses for this as possible without everything getting knocked around and falling over if the table gets bumped. Alright, to get started we're going to need some expanded polystyrene. I'm going to use this stuff that I got from a local hardware store, but you can use just about any kind of polystyrene or even cardboard for the base. Now that we have the polystyrene, we're going to break it down to size. In this case, I want a few varying different sizes as I have a few ideas of how I want to put these together. So I start by scoring one side and digging a little bit deeper before breaking along the scoring edge. Now I have my two pieces, it's time to work them down to size. So to start carving out our terrain, we're going to use a sharp kitchen knife. We're going to go around the edges and start removing any of the areas that are too flat. As we start cutting off bigger sections, we can peel away and scrape at some of the edges to help add some more of that random rocky texture. Now we'll take a few of our offcuts and see if we can make some elevated sections. At this point in the build, you kind of just play around with what you've got and see how it looks. Once you're happy with something, you can move on to the next part, which in my case is building a ramp. The ramps can be a little bit difficult. You've just got to cut in along one edge and then down along the cliff face. It doesn't really matter if these aren't too even, as we'll fix this up later on with some sculptor mold. Keeping your blade sharp is important. As long as you're very careful with it, a sharp blade will actually be a safer cut. It's worth spending a little bit of time on the ramp, making sure that it's a nice even angle, as it's quite difficult for miniatures to sit on anything of a harsh angle. So take your time, and as you go, try adding a miniature on every now and then, just to make sure that it doesn't fall over. Once I had the basic shape carved out in the foam, I added a few magnets to different areas of the board, knowing that later on I could use these to add extra elements onto this flat area. So I picked where I wanted to place my magnets and I pressed them into the foam to give me a marking of where I could cut out the holes. The indentation left a perfect circle of the right size to carve into the foam to give me a nice little recess to add these magnets. Once all the magnet holes were in place, I used a hot glue gun to glue all of the magnets down. Also, a thank you to Miscast Terrain for the idea of the magic stick. All it is a stick with a magnet on it pointing north, so that you always have the same direction when you're using magnets across your builds. This way, anything I've used in the past and anything I use in the future will be able to work together. I also added the magnet to the elevation section so that it would stick to the board, making sure that I used my magic stick to keep all of the polarities in the same direction. Additionally, I used the hot glue gun's hot tip to press some small holes into the board so I could add some small magnets. This gave me the ability to move the pieces around and still give them something solid to hold on to. Now it's time to build the second level. I took the larger piece and a whole heap of the cut off scraps and started to just glue them down wherever I felt it looked natural. I wanted this to mimic a rocky cliff face, as I said, but I also had plans to have a overgrown tree and the roots all pushing through the rock. You can go as wild with this as you like, really adding a lot more texture and elevation. The only problem is that it gets a little bit harder to place miniatures and models on the board if there's too much of this in the area. The larger flat areas, the more use you'll get. I decided I wanted a little bit of an outcrop coming off the edge, so I used a toothpick and some hot glue just to give this a little bit of an extra hold. Then, to hold this in place, I marked a small section on the base and glued a few more of these scrap pieces onto the main base. This would serve as a little blockade and help hold this piece exactly how I was intending. Now it's time to texture up the cliff faces. We essentially just scrape away and pull away at all of the edges until they are nice and random. You can go nuts with this, there are a lot of different methods, but I kind of just like to scratch it at all. It's an easy, simple way, and if I always do this, everything kind of looks random enough to match together. Now that we've got that edge done, it's time to move on to the larger base piece, and just do the same thing to all of the vertical surfaces. Now for an important section, the cleanup. Make sure to keep all the bigger parts, because these can always be useful, and all these smaller parts should be scraped into a little box somewhere, because these are gonna be great when you want to add some extra texture onto any kind of base or building going forward. The next stage is the sculptor mold. This is some homemade sculptor mold, which is basically just some plaster, some grout, and some ground up paper. I'm going to mix this in with some water and some Mod Podge, and later off camera I add a little bit of PVA glue. If you mix it up a little bit too liquidy, you can just add some more of the mixture, or the other way around. If it's too dry, just add a little bit more glue and water. Keep mixing up until you have a similar texture to what you see here. Now the next part of the build can get a little bit messy. So if you like, you might want to wear some gloves, but I kinda just dig into this with my hands after a while. The sculptor mold's great because it dries quite quickly, it tends to stick into the areas you want it to, and it has a nice texture to it. It can be used to really just add any kind of basic texture to a model, or you can use it, in my case, to fill in the gaps that you didn't really bother to blend well as you were carving up the foam. Next up, I'm going to use the rest of the sculptor mold to flatten out the ramp and any of the holes that I accidentally carved as I was building out this base. I'm also going to push sculptor mold into all of these holes and edges, again to fill out anywhere that seems too flat and add some nice natural random texture. You can also just grab a few of your scraps and add a whole heap of the extra sculptor mold that's left over to give you some extra pieces. If you'd like, you can add a magnet to the base of these as well. I also use this opportunity to squeeze a few roots into the sculptor mold, just to give some extra texture of some life popping out of the earth, which is a perfect base for the tree that I plan on adding. These pipe cleaner trees from Encounter Terrain are going to become a constant part of my builds from now on. They are by far the easiest way of making your own trees that I have come across in the 3 years that I've been doing this hobby. All that you'll need is some pipe cleaners. Grab a pile of these and just start twisting. He has a much more in-depth tutorial on his page, but essentially you just twist them up into some roots and break them out in different directions, and then go higher up again and start to twist them out to make individual branches, before coming in with a lighter to help burn back all of the extra fuzz. This stuff tends to burn back nicely and leave a really cool texture that I really like for the look of bark on my creepy dead trees. Now that this is done, the bendiness of the wire works perfectly to hold into the rest of the build. And once you're happy with the shape of the roots, it's time to come in with the hot glue gun and hold everything in place. And now it's time to seal up the model. Using the Blackmagic Craft Mod Podge and black paint mix, I'm going to pour it over everything and try and make sure that I seal up everywhere that there is open and obvious foam, as well as using this opportunity to try and soak this into the tree a little bit to help hold everything in place. As I go, I add a little bit more texture with some rocks and sand, and then come back in with even more of the black Mod Podge until I cover the entire model. Now to repeat the entire process on the larger piece. So once I have everything textured up, I just coat the entire thing with the Black Magic Craft Mod Podge and black paint mix. This seals everything, so when I hit it with spray paint, nothing melts. Next up, I come in with a Zenithal highlight with the Citadel Wraithbone White spray and a coat of Zandri Dust over all of the earth areas. Once this is dry, I tested everything out with an Agrax Earthshade, and it gave a really nice effect. Next up, I came in with a green contrast shade where I knew there'd be some grassy areas, and a Spaceballs Grey around all of the vertical cliff face surfaces. Once I was happy with these colours, I decided to repeat the process on the rest of the elements that would sit on top. The first thing I did was coat the entire thing with a Zenithal highlight of Fiddly Bits Grey that I get from my local Bunnings. This is just a cheap primer, but I really wanted to soak the tree. Once I was happy with the level of paint soaked into the tree, I gave it a coat with a cheap brown, before adding a Zenithal highlight with Citadel Wraithbone White over all of the rocky surfaces, and doing the same process to any smaller parts that you made. And now for the painting. I started with a Citadel Mournfang Brown, but I really wasn't a fan of how it spread over this, so I fairly quickly moved over to my 50-50 Cygor and Contrast medium mix, and this soaked in and gave a nice dark shadow, and this really just gave me the look that I was going for. These trees really do soak up the paint, but I really like the way it looks. It might not be effective for everyone, but for a small piece that's really going to be used as the main focal point of this build, I don't mind putting in a little bit of extra effort. I used a Basilicanum Grey to base the earth on this one, just to test something out a little bit different from the main base. It ended up with a lot more green, so it didn't really matter in the end. Next up, I came in with the Space Wolves Grey for all of the cliff faces, so that this would match the larger base piece that we made earlier. Next up is the dry brushing. I came in with a Tau Light Ochre over the entire tree. This dry brushing method and this kind of tree with the interesting texture leaves a really cool swirling bark effect. After this, we're going to add a whole heap of Mod Podge and start bringing in the flocks. I'm using a lot of the same pieces and colours here that I used on the major board, so it blends in nicely. Making sure to add vining effects up on the cliff faces to really help blend the base model in with the piece that it's going to be sitting on. This also just helps give it the really overgrown Feywild effect that I'm going for. And now that that's done, it's time to season our terrain. We're going to add some parsley. This stuff looks great like dead, rotten leaves. To make sure everything stays in place and doesn't end up getting eaten, we are going to soak it with a 50-50 mix of Mod Podge and water. This will dry hard and hold everything together nicely. Now we've got the rotten leaves, that is a perfect base to grow out a whole lot of grass tufts and flowers. And I have a good stock up of these because I'm a little bit obsessed.
But I love this part, and this is what brings this kind of board to life and really gives it that overgrown, Feywild, jungly feel that I love in a display piece.
So I will shamelessly keep on adding more and more variation and colour. Repeating the process on the other parts. The only difference is with this last piece I added an entire layer of static grass
to help blend it into the bigger board that I built for my Feywild Carnival. Once again, soaking everything in the Mod Podge and water mix just to help seal it together. Spraying some isopropyl alcohol can really help this to spread around and soak into everything nicely. And once that's dried, you've got your modular terrain base. A nice flat piece of terrain that your models can play on, with some magnets to hold these points of interest anywhere on the board.
Additionally, I would like to go through and do a bit more dry brushing over the stone areas with maybe another light grey to add a bit more of a highlight. But again, this is more than good enough for now, and I'm pretty happy with that for a 24-hour build.
Especially when combined with my modular flower beds and overgrowth.
Another way you can use these modular terrain pieces is by carving out the middle and having a secondary layer on top. So once you pull one aside, you reveal the cave or hidden area inside the mountain or cliff face. I've done this on a few builds, and it's a really fun way to reveal something secret to your players that they're definitely not expecting. Going multiple layers deep just makes this even more effective. I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you next time on Seb Makes Stuff.